Another inexpensive, Mr. Compatible Cyclone 5 dev board has hit the market. But what exactly is this board capable of, and how's it different from the existing Terasic and QMTech boards? We'll talk about all this and more as we deep dive into Retro Remake's Mr. Pi. "2024 seems to be the year of the low-cost Mr. setup. Earlier this year, we had the release of the first sub-$100 Cyclone 5 dev board from the company called QMTech. And now, in the second half of 2024, Retro Remake's version of the sub-$100 Cyclone 5 board is now available, if you're one of the lucky individuals that could get your hands on one. The options range from the $99 base kit, which is just the FPGA board and a fan board, on up to the $185 Turbo Pack, which includes the 128MB memory module, a USB hub board, an analog I/O board, a Super NES snack adapter, and an acrylic case. At the time of this recording, there's been a couple of different batches open for ordering, but they all sold out within just a few minutes, so I personally have not been able to buy a Mr. Pi myself. Fortunately though, Bob over at Retro RGB put me in contact with Koala Koa, who graciously lent me a Mr. Pi for this video. And in case you're not familiar with Koala Koa, they make the very cool and polished Mr. M3 kit, which you should definitely go check out. Koala sent me the Mr. Pi Mega Pack in its original packaging, so I was able to experience the unboxing process in its true form. And I have to say, it was all very nicely packaged in a custom box, decorated with a hip Sega-style grid motif. There's even a tiny little box for the SD-RAM module, which was actually quite challenging to get open. And here's the Mr. Pi itself, a slimmed-down DE10 Nano clone made for retro gaming on its Cyclone 5 SoC FPGA. Putting it side by side with the Terasic DE10 Nano, you can see that there are many similarities in the way that it's laid out. The mounting holes, HDMI port, and microSD card slot are in the same location as the DE10 Nano, as well as the location of the GPIO pin headers and the Arduino Shield connectors. Because of this, the Mr. Pi is compatible with existing Mr. I/O boards, so you're not required to buy the analog I/O board offered by Retro Remake. And if you wanted to, you could connect up a digital I/O board instead. Integrating a standard Mr. USB hub board, however, is a different story. The Mr. Pi does use the same SMSC 3300 USB transceiver that's used by both the DE10 Nano and the QMTech board. But the challenge lies in the Mr. Pi's use of a USB-A connector instead of the micro USB port seen on the DE10 Nano. The QMTech board also uses a USB-A port, and as I mentioned in my QMTech video, I actually do prefer it. But the USB-A port does complicate things a bit. If you're looking to use the standard Mr. USB hub board, you'll find that it stacks up fine, and the screw holes line up. But you'll need a short USB-A to micro cable to chain the USB hub board to the Mr. Pi, and that's not a very elegant solution. You do, however, have the option of purchasing the Retro Remake version of the USB hub board for $20. This board includes a row of USB pin headers that connect directly to the bottom of the Mr. Pi, making this a much cleaner option. It's worth noting that the official Mr. USB hub board contains these same USB ports. While they technically could be used to connect to the Mr. Pi, they're laid out in a different orientation, so they don't line up with the Mr. Pi's built-in USB header. So if you want to use the official Mr. USB hub board, you'll need that external USB cable. For powering the device, the Mr. Pi has tossed aside the traditional barrel jack and opted to go with a USB-C power connector. Now, even though this is a USB connector, it only provides power through this port, so you can't use this for standard USB-C accessories. Just like the other Cyclone 5 dev boards, the Mr. Pi has an operating voltage of 5 volts DC. Most USB power adapters output 5 volts by default, so you'll likely be able to use one that you already have. But you do need to make sure that it can provide 2 to 3 amps of current to the board, depending on which accessories you have plugged into the Mr. Pi. Sitting behind this USB-C port is an LDR6328 power delivery chip. As I was saying earlier, USB traditionally only provides 5 volts, but the PD standards were introduced a little over 10 years ago as a way to use varying voltage levels across USB. To make this work, both the power source and the device consuming the power use these special PD chips. These chips will talk to each other across the USB connection and negotiate an agreed upon voltage that the power source will provide. The PD chip used in the Mr. Pi leverages version 3.0 of the standard, which can negotiate up to 20 volts at 5 amps over USB. But just because the chip's capable of that doesn't mean that the Mr. Pi is configured to allow that high of a voltage. So to determine the maximum it negotiates, I plugged the board into a PD charger that's capable of 20 volts and placed a USB multimeter in line. And I found that it negotiates a maximum of 12 volts over USB. So to trim 12 volts down to 5, the Mr. Pi uses a buck converter. Now, there are several buck converters on this board, and the schematic for the Mr. Pi isn't available. So I had to probe around to figure out which one was handling the input voltage conversion. And I found that it was this one right here. You can see that I'm reading 12 volts on its input pins, which is coming from the voltage bus on the USB connector. For the brains of the device, the Mr. Pi has the standard Cyclone 5 SoC FPGA mounted in the center of the board. And surprisingly, this is a different variant of the Cyclone 5 than what we've seen in the other Mr. boards. Those boards all run the SE version of the chip, but this Mr. Pi board that I'm examining here has the SX version. The main difference between the SE and the SX is that the SX has high-speed serial transceivers built in. These transceivers can operate at up to 3 gigabits per second, so if you have serial devices connected to these transceivers, the data transfer rate will be much quicker. But the mere presence of these transceivers doesn't actually do anything. The FPGA cores would need to be programmed to take advantage of them in order to use them. Another difference with the Mr. Pi's chip is its thermal rating. In my QMTech review video, I talked about how the DE10 Nano has an industrial rating, which gives it a maximum operating temperature of 100 degrees Celsius. And the QMTech boards have an automotive rating with a higher temperature range of up to 125 degrees. Like the DE10 Nano, the Mr. Pi's FPGA is also rated as an industrial chip, so its maximum operating temperature is 100 degrees Celsius, making it lower than the QMTech boards. But aside from these two things, the other characteristics of the Cyclone 5 are the same across all three boards. They're all the ARM-based SoC version. The FPGA has 110,000 logic elements. They come in an ultra-fine BGA package with 672 pins, and they all have the same fabric speed grade. In addition to the FPGA, the Mr. Pi has many other chips in common with the DE10 Nano and QMTech alternatives. The HDMI controller is the typical ADV7513 from Analog Devices, so no surprises there. And the Ethernet controller is also the same KSZ9031 chip as well. And like the other Cyclone 5 dev boards, there's 1 GB of DDR3 memory on board for the hard processor system. For this memory, the Mr. Pi uses a couple of chips from Micron with the part number D9SHG. By using Micron's part number decoder, we can see that each of these chips have a CAS latency rating of CL13, which means that the data is available 13 clock cycles after it's requested. This is similar to the QMTech boards, which also have Micron chips with a latency rating of CL13, but the original DE10 Nano wins out with ISSI chips that are rated at CL9. There's been some debate as to whether or not these higher latency chips are going to negatively impact the performance of Mr. cores. I think the verdict's still out, but I personally haven't really noticed any performance issues when running these higher latency Micron RAM chips. I did discover one chip on board the Mr. Pi that has me scratching my head though. If you look at the underside, you'll notice this 8-pin chip here made by Boya Micro with the part number 25Q64ES. This is a 64 megabit flash chip, and I have no idea why it's here. As far as I know, the Mr. doesn't make use of it. Now, the DE10 Nano also has a flash chip, but it makes sense for that board since it's meant to be a general purpose FPGA dev kit. But the QMTech board, which was designed for a Mr. First experience, doesn't have one, and it functions perfectly fine. I was really curious as to what's on this flash chip, so I asked Koalakoa if I could go ahead and solder on some test leads in order to read off the contents. And I was given the thumbs up to proceed. So I wired it up to my chip dumper and dumped its contents to an 8 megabyte bin file. I opened it with the hex editor, and sure enough, there was data on this chip. I spent some time going through the file and looking for any recognizable strings and patterns that might indicate what kind of data is stored on the flash chip, but I didn't see anything that immediately stood out. To get a little help, I uploaded the file to ChatGPT, and with a little bit of prompting, I encouraged it to do some analysis for me. It started out with the same process that I performed manually, looking for recognizable strings or file patterns. But it didn't just stop there. It performed an entropy analysis, looked for file signatures, examined it for hex patterns, and looked for heuristic indicators of a file system. It even attempted to disassemble the data as machine code, and at some point, it went so far as to give me a visual graph of the data so I can help it find specific areas of interest to dig into a little deeper. But after all that, I came up empty-handed. I have no idea what's in this flash chip. Maybe Taki can shed some light on this, but in the meantime, I went ahead and posted the flash dump online. If you want to take a look, there's a link in the description below. If you come across anything interesting or make any headway as to what's in there, please post a comment and let me know. When you compare the Mr. Pi with the QMTech and DE10 Nano side by side, you'll notice that it's missing the mini USB port that the other boards have sitting next to the Ethernet jack. This port is used as a serial interface, which gives developers a way to interact with the dev board from their computer. It's not typically used by the average Mr. user, but if you're a developer, then it could be used for debugging or using a serial console into the ARM processor. The Mr. Pi does include a serial debugger connection, but rather than using the traditional mini USB connector, there's another USB-C port instead. You don't see USB-C being used for this type of connection very often, but it's certainly a lot more convenient than having to dig around for an old mini USB cable. The DE10 Nano also has another mini USB port near the HDMI connector. If you're an FPGA developer, then you need a way to program the FPGA from your computer. The typical approach is to use a special 10-pin header called a JTAG connector, which is what the QMTech board has. But this requires an external programmer that can be expensive and inconvenient. So Terasic made it easy for developers by including this external programmer in the DE10 Nano directly via the mini USB port. Like the QMTech board, however, the Mr. Pi doesn't have this external programmer built in. So instead of providing the mini USB connector, it has a traditional 10-pin JTAG header in its place. So if you're an FPGA developer writing cores on the Mr. Pi, you'll need to pick up an external JTAG programmer. In addition, the Mr. Pi has the DE10 Nano's LTC header, which is also called the Quick Eval connector. If you already own a complete Mr. setup, then you might recognize this as where you would plug in your real-time clock board. Now, the Mr. doesn't require a real-time clock. If you have an internet connection, then the system will synchronize its clock over the internet when you power it on. However, when you turn the mister off, it loses its sense of time. To get around that, the real-time clock board adds a clock IC and a battery, which keeps the clock ticking even when the device is powered off. The clock chip uses the I2C protocol to interact with the cyclone, and that's what the quick eval connector provides. But this connector didn't start off that way. Terasic introduced it in their FPGA development boards as a way to interface with daughter boards produced by a company called Linear Technology Corporation. LTC made a variety of demo boards that interfaced with the DE10 Nano over this special 14-pin connector. But in 2016, LTC was acquired by Analog Devices, the same company that makes the HDMI chip that all these dev boards use. And Analog Devices still makes daughter boards that use the quick eval connector today. At its heart, this connector is really nothing more than a set of additional pins for interfacing with the Cyclone's ARM processor over the I2C or SPI protocols. Since the QMTech board doesn't have a quick eval connector, you can't plug in a traditional RTC module like you can with the Mr. Pi. But QMTech gets around that by including the RTC chip and battery in the analog I/O board, which I think is actually a better solution anyway. To support this, QMTech included I2C pins on its additional 40-pin header, which the I/O board plugs into. But as you can see, the Mr. Pi carries on the tradition of including the quick eval connector instead. Now, one thing you may not realize is that all of these Cyclone 5 dev boards split off the 5-volt source voltage into multiple power rails, and this is because some of the chips on the board require a different voltage level. In fact, that's why there's so many buck converters on the Mr. Pi. Each of these step down the voltage to a different level. But on the original DE10 Nano, there are two places where the voltage is actually increased. The first is at pin 1 of the quick eval connector, and the other is pin 8 of the Arduino header. In both of these cases, the voltage is bumped up to 9 volts. Now, there's no chips on the DE10 Nano that require a 9-volt power source. Terasic only included this for external devices. And as far as I know, there's nothing in the Mr. ecosystem that takes advantage of this 9-volt power rail. Now, the QMTech board doesn't include the traditional Arduino header nor the quick eval connector, so QMTech doesn't even bother having a 9-volt rail. But the Mr. Pi includes both of these connectors, and sure enough, it generates the 9-volt rail. But the question is, why? The only reason I can think of including it is because the DE10 Nano includes it. And perhaps the Mr. Pi is looking to maximize compatibility in case a Mr. accessory comes along that actually uses it. Alright, let's switch gears now and run the Mr. Pi through a few tests. I ran most of these tests on the DE10 Nano and the QMTech boards in my QMTech review video, and I wanted to do the same here so we can compare the results. I started off by measuring the power efficiency of the Mr. Pi by measuring its current usage over time. For this, I used the same conditions as the previous tests: a bare Mr. Pi with no cooling solution and the retro Remake SD-RAM module attached to it. I also plugged in the same USB controller directly into its USB-A port and connected it to the same HDMI monitor. And for the test load, I used the PSX demo program and let it run for 5 minutes. After the 5 minutes was up, I used the video recording to manually sample the current drawn every 10 seconds, and I plotted it in a line graph. And the results were actually a bit surprising. Running off the 5-volt power source, the Mr. Pi drew an average of 1.11 amps of current. In my previous tests, the QMTech board drew 1.22 amps, so the Mr. Pi actually consumed about 100 milliamps less. And the difference is even greater when compared with the DE10 Nano, which drew an average of 1.43 amps. So the Mr. Pi does seem to be the most power efficient choice given the current market. Throughout my testing, I also ran a thermal imaging camera to take a temperature measurement of the FPGA and the Mr. Pi board overall. In my earlier testing, the DE10 Nano ran a maximum temperature of 64.9 degrees after 5 minutes of playing the PSX demo ROM, and the QMTech board ran slightly cooler, hitting 64.4 degrees. But what about the Mr. Pi? Well, after 5 minutes under the same conditions, the FPGA was at a cool 63 degrees Celsius, beating out both boards. For the Mr. Pi, however, the heat put off by the Cyclone chip isn't the only thing we need to be concerned about. As I mentioned earlier, you can use a PD power adapter, and the Mr. Pi will negotiate up to 12 volts for its power signal. But since the board operates at 5 volts, the conversion process will generate excess heat. And if you look at Retro Remake's website, you'll see that they acknowledge this and even recommend running an active cooling solution when using a PD power adapter. But in reality, this excess heat will come off the buck converter and not the FPGA. So if you're only actively cooling the Cyclone 5, it's not going to ease the thermal performance of that buck converter. To understand this better, let's point the thermal camera at this chip right here. This is the buck converter that trims down the USB voltage to 5 volts. First, I'll feed the Mr. Pi with a 5 volt USB power source, and after a few minutes, you can see that this buck converter stays at a relatively cool temperature of around 50 degrees Celsius. Next, I'll switch over to a PD adapter, which negotiates an input voltage of 12.2 volts. And now, within just a couple of minutes, you can see the heat signature of that buck converter rise over 20 degrees. So if you're using a PD power adapter with your Mr. Pi, you're not going to want to just rely on actively cooling the FPGA. You'll also want to consider perhaps putting a heatsink on that buck converter directly. Or better yet, just use a 5 volt USB power supply. The next thing I wanted to test wasn't the Mr. Pi itself, but rather the SDRAM module that comes with the kit. I've noticed that there's been some negative feedback surrounding this module, so I was keen on running the memory tester and comparing the results to a couple of other RAM modules. Before I jump into that though, let me explain how the memory tester works. When you fire up the memtest utility, you're greeted with a rather cryptic screen. This first group of numbers in the upper left is the number of minutes that the tester has been running for. In the upper right, the 3 digits represent the speed in megahertz that the memory is being tested at. In the middle row of digits that are colored light blue, the single-digit number on the left represents the size of the memory module. The fact that there's a 3 here indicates that we have a 128 megabyte module in this system. And directly next to that on the right is a 6-digit hexadecimal number that represents the number of test cycles that have passed. This number should be incrementing at a pretty steady pace. And finally, the last row of 8 red digits is the number of test cycles that have failed. You want this to remain 0 throughout the testing. Now, all memory tests will fail if you run the memory at a high enough speed. At some point, the memory chip just won't be able to keep up with everything that's going on the bus. So the question that we really want to answer is, how fast can we run the memory without it producing any errors? To determine this, the memory tester starts off in auto mode, which means that it attempts to run the memory at a very high speed and then incrementally lowers it when it encounters errors. Once the test runs error-free for a couple of hours, you can put a stake in the ground and declare that frequency as the maximum speed that the memory module is stable at. To start off, I'm going to test one of the official Mr. Memory modules, which I purchased from Mr. Add-ons a couple of years ago. And after running the test for about 2 hours, you can see that we've stabilized at 147 megahertz. This is a good result and indicates that we have some decent memory here. Next, I want to test the memory modules that are in the version of QMTech's board that comes with built-in SDRAM. This is a version of QMTech Cyclone 5 dev board with the SDRAM chips soldered underneath, eliminating the need to add an external memory module. This is the board that I use in the DIY Mr. Handheld, so I'll run the memory test directly from there. And after 2 hours, you can see that this memory has stabilized at 150 MHz, which is a great result. Finally, let's take a look at the SD-RAM module that came with the Mr. Pi kit. Just like the others, I let it stabilize for 2 hours, and we have a maximum speed of 144 MHz. The fact that it's lower than the other memory I tested doesn't mean that the memory is bad. Anything over 140 MHz is great, and well within the acceptable range of 130 MHz or higher. I do want to point out though, that the other memory boards use Alliance memory chips, which are known and trusted by the community. The Mr. Pi, on the other hand, uses chips from e-tron technology. Again, this doesn't mean that they're bad chips, it's just something worth noting. Over the past few weeks that the Mr. Pi's been available, I've noticed a couple of issues popping up online. But there's one in particular that's intrigued me the most, which I really wanted to dig into. This Mr. Pi user was experiencing microSD card corruption after power cycling the system multiple times. I wanted to see if I could reproduce the problem, so I started out by creating a fresh Mr. Fusion installation on a microSD card, using the same process described in the Reddit post. I then connected the Mr. Pi to my home automation system and created a script to power it on, let it run for a little bit, and then power it down. I had the script repeat this process 1,000 times over the course of several hours. Afterwards, I examined the microSD card in my computer, and I found that everything was fine. So it was no surprise when I turned on the Mr. Pi for the 1001st time, and it booted right up and let me play a game. My guess is that this issue isn't systemic. It's probably just a one-off defect that this particular person encountered. Well, we've looked at quite a bit in this video, and to be honest, there's even more that I wanted to cover. For now though, we're out of time. So, I'll see you next time. And as always, until then, go make something cool.